Hi, class. I'm going to talk to you today about Carter Wilson's book, Racism from Slavery to Advanced Capitalism. So, you all did diagrams of the chapter you read, which focused on the maintenance of slavery and reproduction of racial oppression during and after the American Revolution. So, your diagrams are, some of them are very complex and detailed, offering different pieces of each of those three components: economic structure, political elites, and racist culture. So some of the diagrams have different components defining what goes into each of those elements, and some of the models are simpler. I'll share with you how I used Carter Wilson in my book. Now, my model is much simpler than what students do because students have one diagram that they're putting all of Carter Wilson in, and I had an entire book, so I had more space to develop other diagrams. We're not reading his entire book where you took the chapter and you put it all into that one model. So there's different ways to do it. My diagram, again, it's simple. It's not as colorful as student diagrams because I have several places in the book where I'm kind of unpacking this. But if we just took this simple model approach and explained his basic idea, Carter Wilson is arguing that an oppressive economic structure creates a racist culture. And that racist culture includes all sorts of controlling images, ideologies like the racist paternalistic ideology. So the idea that enslavers were like parents and that enslaved people were like children. And so you get the images of the Black Sambo and Mammy to support that racist ideology. You have scientific racist ideology that is part of the racist culture, and that is developed by political elites who, that racist culture helps to sustain their position in power because they're benefiting from that economic structure. So these pieces are mutually reinforcing. However, Carter Wilson, because he is drawing on Marxist economic theory, he does put the economic structure at the top of his model as a central piece of the model. That, he argues, is what causes all of this. The racist culture comes out of the oppressive economic structure. The racist culture then helps to reinforce the economic structure, but it is the mode of production in place, and in this case, in the piece of the chapter that you read, slavery, that produces and creates the racism, not the other way around. And within the discussion of those controlling images, he makes a really important observation about the psychological elements of images like the Black Sambo. So on page 74, he states that Blacks played the role of Sambo in order to survive the Holocaust of white racist hysteria, and whites needed the Sambo to feed their egos and mask their terror of slave revolts. Thus, the Sambo image functioned in Southern society to reinforce whites' views of themselves as Christian and civilized, and their perspective of the slave as happy and childlike. Whites had to see the slave as Sambo, or they would have been driven to the brink of insanity by their fear of the slave and by their own inhumanity. So he talks also that there is a kind of psychological and survival function that the image, the controlling image, served for white elites and for working class white people who were involved in this system, who were making a living off of this system, that they had to see Black people as Sambo to kind of resolve that cognitive dissonance and justify this brutal treatment. And that for African Americans, it was also serving a survival function. So he's looking at this economic theory, but also thinking about this in terms of sociology and psychology as well. His main argument is that racism evolves, and it evolves in the way that it is manifest depending on the mode of production in place. Again, it's that Marxist economic theory that it's dependent upon the mode of production. So within this period of chattel slavery, the type of racism that then dominates, that gets produced out of that structure, is dominative racism. So it's a particularly brutal type of racism that helps to maintain the system. And it's within that context that you get laws like the Fugitive Slave Act, and brutal practices like castration. And at this time, African Americans, their movement is being controlled, but the movement of European Americans, of white people, is also being controlled to some extent. that white abolitionists, their behavior is also being monitored when they are helping Black people. So they are controlled when they are acting to help Black people. So you see an increase of monitoring of white abolitionist practices in particular, and the monitoring of the literature, of abolitionist literature that you read about. So I've magnified the piece, the racist culture piece of Carter Wilson. So though again, Wilson is looking at these three factors. When I took his work and applied it to interracial organization, I magnified this racist culture piece to show that organizational cultures are impacted by external racist ideologies. So a lot of the work that looks at organizational practices and interactions of people within organizations, they look at the organizational culture and how that influences it. But in my book, I looked at how external racist ideology that has kind of evolved from what we saw with Wilson, from that biological racism to cultural racism to colorblind racism. We have a different economic structure today, and that produces a different kind of racist ideology, and that is colorblind racism. That external belief system and liberal discourse that focuses on civility and professionalism acts on organizational culture, I argue in my work. And the result of that, it produces racism evasiveness, or a denial of racism. So this pressure to not want to see, to claim that we don't see color, the focus on that colorblind perspective then leads to racism denial and interactions within organizations that are very superficial when it comes to race and racism, and a fear of addressing racism internally. As Carter Wilson argues, the racist culture shapes the way we think and behave toward race and racism. So if that is the case, and colorblind ideology is the dominant form of racism, the way it gets expressed today, then it shapes, that can act on organizational culture and shape the way people interact and talk or do not talk about race and racism within their organization. So racism evolves. It's one of the key contributions of Carter Wilson's work. I've mentioned this before, that so scientific racism helps to promote a certain type of brutal racism that argues that if racial disparities exist, it is because people are biologically different. Today, we don't make those claims. That it morphed into replacing biology with culture. So the argument that if there are disparities and Black and Latine and Indigenous people aren't doing as well or have higher rates of poverty disproportionately, then that is because they have deficient cultures. So those arguments became more popular. And then that morphs into colorblind racism. Well, we just don't see color, and it leads to very superficial analyses of racism and a denial of racism. So that's one of the key contributions of Carter Wilson, that racism takes whatever form it needs to take depending on the mode of production, and it works to uphold the system. And so paying attention to how racism becomes more subtle and sophisticated over time. And that doesn't mean that earlier forms of racism disappear. So while biological racism is frowned upon, it's not socially acceptable, that doesn't mean that people don't believe in biology and racism. The other key point that is important to remember with Carter Wilson is that repeatedly in that chapter and throughout his work, he focuses on human agency, that we tend to focus on systemic racism, as we should, because there was a time when people only reduced racism to individual actions. And so it was important to understand that racism is systemic. It's not just about what individuals do. But what he's showing is that throughout history, these structures were created by human beings. So we shouldn't forget that human agency plays a role, and he's giving us a model that shows the interaction between structure and human agency. And so finally, I'd like you to think about how Wilson's model might apply to different time periods, like Reconstruction. So we looked at this period of the American Revolution, but we can take those models that you developed, take Wilson's conceptual work, and drop it into the period of Reconstruction, which we will see in the film Slavery by Another Name, and the development of policing and mass incarceration. We can look at the case of the Exonerated Five in the 1980s and what was happening at that time with the development and economics behind mass incarceration and the politics. The rise of the law and order politician, what was going on with the racist culture, what kinds of imagery develops of Black men that really supports this, the type of racism that's developing in that time period. You could also think about how Wilson's work applies globally. We've looked at this with Goulash-Boza in France, Brazil, South Africa. How might his work apply across the globe? And finally, other systems of oppression. Wilson is talking about how racial oppression is reproduced. Could those elements of economic structure, political elites, and racist culture, could we develop a model that explains the discrimination over time of LGBTQ plus people, or sexism in the system of patriarchy, or disability justice and disability injustice? So we have a lot to glean from Wilson's work, a lot of different ways that we can think of how we might apply that to our own research. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me.